recently the Senate Foreign Relations Committee passed unanimously a bill that would require the president to submit an agreement to Congress for approval, and would require the president to withhold from waiving any sanctions on Iran for at least 30 days. Does this destroy the chances for an agreement? Is it send a signal to Iran that it's not worth it? Because in the end, the US Congress may just simply reject it? Or is there still a prospect that within this context, one can find an arrangement that can work?
No, I don't think it destroys the prospects for a comprehensive agreement. There's been a lot of backing and forthing, understandably, between the administration and Congress and within the Congress over this issue. I think what Senator Corker and Senator Cardin and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee produced by a 19-0 vote, is a reasonable compromise, as President Obama put it. And I think Senator Corker and Senator Cardin deserve a lot of credit for helping to produce that. I think it preserves an appropriate and constructive role for the Congress in dealing with what is a very important issue. But I think it gives the President and Secretary Kerry the latitude that they need to try to complete a very important negotiation.
I'm sure it's impossible to handicap what might happen in terms of sanctions relief. It's obviously an issue that is of fundamental concern to many of the people in this audience to understand what might happen and potential for oil markets into the future, as well as opening up the prospects for investment into Iran. Realistically, there are limits in what actually can be said at this time. Obviously, there's a negotiation process that one is going through. But how can you help the audience here sort of understand the negotiating dynamics about the timing of sanctions relief and what some of the critical factors are going to be? What signals can they look for to help understand what might happen in terms of changes in energy markets and prospects for investment?
Well, I think from the point of view of the P5+1, the United States and our negotiating partners, there are a couple things that are most important in looking at sanctions relief, and we understand the significance that Iranians attach to that. First is to ensure, much as we did in the interim agreement, that sanctions relief occurs as Iranians demonstrate their compliance with the agreement. And there are various ways in which you can front load, substantial sanctions relief and take quite significant steps to terminate the application of sanctions early in the process. But working out the choreography of that and the precise details of it is not an easy thing, and it's going to take some time. Second is to try to ensure that there's a clear mechanism available in case of violations by Iran that you can reapply sanctions and thus preserve the leverage that has helped bring us to the point where we've had serious negotiations and I think made substantial progress in them. So those are the two things, I think, from the perspective of the international negotiators that are most important. I think as you look ahead to the impact on the energy market, and I'm no expert on that, but I've seen a lot of industry analysis which suggests that whereas a few years ago Iran was exporting something like 2.5 million barrels a day, as a result of sanctions, especially since 2012, that's been reduced to about 1 million barrels a day, that it would probably take somewhere beyond a year, even 18 months, from the moment that sanctions relief kicks in to move from the current levels back to the 2.5 million barrels a day level. As all of you in this audience know far better than I do, moving upwards beyond those levels in terms of oil production and oil exports in Iran is going to require some quite substantial investment in infrastructure, which has lacked for that kind of investment for a long time. So there's, I think, inevitably going to be a kind of lag in terms of the time it requires. Gas is a little bit different issue in the sense that there's been, over the course of the last year, a growth in Iranian natural gas production. All of you know as well as I do the enormous resources in gas in Iran. But there again, I think there's going to have to be substantial outside investment in infrastructure to make possible a significant increase in production.
Bill, one of several of the questions here go to the issue of how do you enforce an agreement if it goes wrong? What levers are there?
Well, I think one of the levers is what I mentioned, that is to ensure that there's a mechanism for reapplication of sanctions very, very quickly if there's a violation. Now, that's a complicated package to put together, but I think it's absolutely essential. Second, I think it's important to remember that all the various options and levers that an American president has today, that our partners have, would in essence remain before us in case of an agreement that either wasn't reached because there's a breakdown or an agreement that was reached and was later violated. I think the reality is that if you look at the record of the interim agreement over the last year and a half, there's been a pretty substantial record of compliance on both sides with the terms of that. So I think while the details are going to be extraordinarily hard to pin down over the course of the next few months, if a comprehensive agreement is reached, which means it's got to have the verification and monitoring procedures tightly drawn, as I was describing before, as well as the other features of a good comprehensive agreement, then I think the odds are that you'll see compliance over time. But again, we'll have to have a measure that would allow us to reapply sanctions, and we'll have, available to us the whole range of instruments in national security.
You've said, Bill, a number of times, and you repeated today, you can't bomb knowledge away. Why is a military option not a simple solution?
Well, I mean, just as a practical matter, and again, President Obama has been very clear about not taking any options off the table, and I think that's a sensible and prudent approach. But I think if you look at what it would require militarily, that the best estimates I've seen are that you'd probably set back Iran's nuclear program by a couple of years. And I think when you compare that against the possibility that in a strong negotiated agreement, you could actually have in place, not just for a decade, but in some respects for 15 or 20 years or even beyond that, some very tight constraints and intrusive verification measures, that the appeal of that strong negotiated agreement, I think, is pretty obvious. And that's why I think it's well worth the effort, even if it's going to be very difficult to achieve.
Maybe if we can, in wrapping up, kind of bring this back to the broader picture of the Middle East and global stability. If there is an agreement, what is the potential significance for how this might change the Middle East? Is it too much to hope that it could be a foundation for something which is bigger, and that, let's just look at it as what it is, it stopped the development of an Iranian nuclear weapon? Or is this something of greater political significance?
Well, first, I think it's a very, if such an agreement is reached, I think it'll be a reminder of the enduring value of diplomacy, which, in the Middle East in recent years has not been, something that has, a lot to point to in terms of achievements. And I think that's, a value that's sometimes underestimated. As I said, I think we have to be clear-eyed about the reality that even if there's a comprehensive nuclear agreement, you're likely to see continuing sources of friction given Iran's behavior in some other parts of the region. I hope over time that may ease, but you can't base a policy or a strategy on hope. You have to look, I think, in a very straightforward way at the pattern of challenges that we've seen, and therefore I think it's going to be very important to embed a nuclear agreement in that wider strategy, because I think, much as in the case of our approach to the nuclear issue, it took building leverage and sanctions and pressure coupled with a serious commitment to diplomacy to help Iranians reevaluate their nuclear strategy. I think in the region, it's also going to require that kind of firm support for our friends and partners, coupled with a willingness to engage diplomatically that could, over time, produce that kind of a shift. But I don't assume that that's going to happen. I certainly don't assume it's going to happen overnight. And therefore, I think it's very important for us to have a clear-eyed strategy across that range of other issues.